Of all Christmas foods in Great Britain, Christmas pudding is arguably the most iconic of them all. Sure, you have your mince pies and goose, but the highlight of the Great British Christmas feast is when the plum pudding is brought out and set alight. But what if I told you that this pudding started out as a goopy liquid porridge and had nothing to do with Christmas? The unassuming Christmas pudding actually has a lot more interesting history than you would expect. Sure, at first glance it just looks like a jiggly damp cake, but if we look closer we'll find out that the history of the Christmas or plum pudding is storied, to say the least. It starts in medieval England, potentially with porpoise meat, goes on to become very important to the Royal Navy, gets offered to the Mozart family, becomes Napoleonic propaganda, and then eventually settles down in the Victorian era by being set ablaze. Quite a journey. Better get started. In order to get a good grasp of the Christmas pudding, we need to ask ourselves 3 questions. How did it come about? Why is it such a British thing? And lastly, why is it so strongly associated with Christmas? First up, origins. The precursors of the Christmas pudding weren't puddings or round balls at all, but rather liquid porridges or pottages. As with a lot of English cooking, we can find the ancestors of this Christmas pudding in the Forme of Cury, the oldest English language cookbook from the 14th century. And it contains 2 porridges that are great candidates for the title of Granddaddy of the Plum Pudding: Figgy and Fermenty. Of the 2, the one with the name Figgy sounds like the more promising candidate. It is the one in that song. Even its ingredients are a bunch of things you would expect to be served at Christmas, as it's a porridge containing ground almonds, raisins, honey, wine, ginger and, as the name suggests, figs. This is all lovely and a great starting point, but it's missing the heft we know in puddings. This additional element probably comes from our second Forme of Cury dish, a porridge called fermenty, which is a porridge made from wheat boiled in almond milk. It was boiled in almond milk, not cow's milk, so it could be eaten during fasting periods. The Forme of Cury does suggest an alternative protein though. Porpoise. We initially thought this might have been a word that had changed meaning over time, like porpoise or something like that. But no, it's porpoise. Which made perfect sense because as it's an aquatic animal, that meant it could also be eaten during fasting periods. But as you can see, these porridges are pretty different from our desired Christmas treat. Especially structurally speaking, it wasn't until the late 16th century that we first see a mention of a technique that brings us one step closer to our beloved Christmas icon, the art of turning loose porridges into solid puddings. Pudding probably comes from the French word boudin, which means sausage, sort of. A lot of food terms, especially the ones involving meat, got French names after the Norman conquest. To make a pudding, we take a porridge, like these, with or without meat or dried fruit, bind them with a fat like lard or suet, and then stuff it into an animal's stomach or intestine and boil. This process changes the texture and it has the added benefit of massively extending the shelf life of the food. This might sound old-fashioned and archaic, but it still happens today. 2 famous examples are the black pudding, still very popular in the British Isles today, and Scotland's pride, the haggis. Over time, more and more things got put into puddings. Pudding a fight? Anyway, with or without meat. It actually became pretty tricky to find things that the British wouldn't pudding. A great illustration can be found in the 1615 cookbook by John Murrell, A New Book of Cookery. It lists a bunch of puddings, most of them with meat. Now, for most of these meaty puddings, like veal, mutton or boar, the book actually instructs the reader to make these fatty pottages or porridges and stuff them into a caul, most likely the membrane from around the organs of the animal, or skins. That would be the intestines. One might think it's tricky to get your hands on the caul or the stomach of an animal, and these days it sort of is. But back then, if you were cooking from a book, you were either rich or, much more likely, you were cooking for a rich, large household, which meant that you got your meat whole, either freshly killed from a hunter as game, or, in the cases of veal and mutton, alive. Which meant that you often got everything in one go, so the casings would be provided. You know, think of it like those sushi kits where you get the seaweed and rice in a little mat all in one go. But this doesn't work for all puddings. Smaller animals like geese or swan won't have bits large enough. And what about the meatless puddings? Well, John Murrell offers us a solution: the pudding cloth. The Cambridge pudding, even though it isn't a plum pudding yet, gets awfully close. There's a bunch of spices, dried fruit, milk, suet and butter mixed together and stuffed in a cloth. Which is great news for us modern people, because a muslin cloth is really easy and cheap to get. Intestines and stomachs, not so much. We're not going to make the Cambridge pudding here today, but we'll leave a link for those of you who want to give it a go. The plum pudding we will be making is the first recipe to call itself plum pudding. It's from a collection of above 300 receipts in cookery, physic and surgery for the use of all good wives, tender mothers and careful nurses. A book by Mary Kettleby from 1717. That's almost 100 years after the Cambridge pudding. It might be the first recipe to be headed plum pudding, but it's not the first mention of plum pudding, at least that we could find. But we'll get to that later. The 1717 plum pudding recipe isn't that different from modern Christmas pudding. Take out a bowl and add 225 grams of suet, 225 grams of raisins, 2 spoonfuls of both flour and sugar, 3 egg yolks and 2 egg whites. These are all the quantities from the original recipe halved, but feel free to double everything. You'll notice the lack of plums. That's because plum was actually a catch-all term for dried fruits. Give all of this a good stirring while in the back your cloth boils. When your pudding is stirred and your cloth is thoroughly boiled, flour up your cloth and put your pudding mixture in the cloth. We recommend using a bowl for this and tie it up nice and tight so it gets a vaguely round shape. Originally, these would be hung up over the pot, causing the pudding to be suspended in the boiling water, giving us that signature cannonball shape. Tying the cloth around the roasting spit was a popular way of doing this. Modern kitchens, however, tend to be short on big roasting spits, therefore we are just going to dunk our pudding into the boiling water with a little steamer basket on the bottom to prevent it from burning. You can also do this with a plate if you don't have a steamer basket, but this will make a bit of a racket. Let it boil for 3 hours if you're using our halved version, 4 hours if you are using the full original amounts. It might seem odd for people back in the olden days to cook something for that long. Fuel was, as it is today, quite costly. However, these would be heated up by the hearth, which would be on anyway in cold winter months, so no extra fuel was needed. There are no mentions of brandy or anything like that, so we're just going to have a raw bite. And that's pretty much how the plum pudding came about. Medieval porridges were put through this fancy new process, and this big round dumpling is the result. It's not bad, but it's rather bland and not really like the puddings we're used to these days. Well, we say used to, but that's only if you're from Great Britain or Ireland, Australia, South Africa or Canada. You know, countries that, with the exception of Ireland, make up a large portion of the Commonwealth, or as we used to call it, the Empire. And as you might have guessed, yes, these traditions did emanate from the central colonial power that was Great Britain. And that brings us to our second question. Why is Great Britain so in love with its pudding? Well, the answer itself consists of 3 parts: sailors, the Empire, and roast beef. Let's start with roast beef. Plum pudding has a reputation of going very well with roast beef. Ever since at least the 17th century, the English have been very big on their roast beef. Roast beef was, and to a degree still is, a key element of the British and especially English identity. In the 18th century there were songs like "Oh, the roast beef of old England", and it was often said that an Englishman could not live abroad as he would wither away due to the lack of roast beef. Really, if you want to know more about the English love for roast beef, we made a video about that. Because plum pudding and roast beef were seen to go so well together, they were often cooked together. The roast would be in front of the heart and the pudding would be underneath, slowly cooking in its own juices and catching the drippings falling from the joint. Small aside, this is also why a Yorkshire pudding, even though it never got stuffed into anything, is called the Yorkshire pudding because it took the place of the pudding underneath the roast, catching the drippings, even though it was made from entirely different things. Pudding would be served before or alongside the roast beef. This was all extremely English. As we know, Mozart's father was at one point offered roast beef with plum pudding when he was on tour here with his son. He wasn't much of a fan though. He went on to call it elend, which means miserable. Next up in the reasons why the plum pudding is so quintessentially English, the Empire. As we can see by its popularity throughout the Commonwealth, Great Britain spread its love for the pudding to its overseas territories. But it wasn't a one-way street. Cheaper spices and sugar from these overseas territories would actually allow the pudding to evolve, and because of that, it would go on to become a symbol of the empire. A good illustration of this is the famous caricature The Plum Pudding in Danger, showing William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister at the time, and Napoleon Bonaparte splitting up the world. England has a bigger share, but Napoleon is slicing off most of Europe, including Hanover, the ancestral home of the British monarchs. Britain is sort of left in the middle with Scandinavia. This is a reference to the continental system, a sort of super Brexit where Napoleon outlawed all trade between Britain and the continent. The artist of the caricature is clearly worried that this would make some of the ingredients of the plum pudding completely unaffordable. At least they didn't vote for it themselves back then. Speaking of international trade, that brings us to our third element, seamen. Sailors. Sailors. Just like with the Empire, the plum pudding shaped the sailors, but the sailors also shaped the plum pudding. Puddings were a really big deal aboard British ships. When the plum pudding spread throughout the Empire, it became a symbol of England, by way of its seamen. Sailors. Sailors. A great example that shows the importance of puddings aboard British vessels is this letter from the Admiralty from 1692. It reads that pudding cloths should be provided to the crew so they can cook their puddings. In addition, the actual first mention of a plum pudding that we found comes from the Diary of a Sailor. Diary of a Sailor. But we'll get to this. All sources do seem to indicate that puddings were an important part of the diet of Jack Tars. Puddings make food last extremely long, and it will even allow you to preserve fruits. If you're at sea and trying to fend off scurvy, what's not to love? This was all a positive feedback loop. Puddings kept the sailors fed, and in turn, the intercontinental trade enabled by these men would allow for the puddings to get richer and better by making spices and sugar cheaper. We've explained why plum puddings were so important to the British as a Georgian side dish that was eaten before or alongside the roasts. But plum puddings, or Christmas puddings as we tend to call them these days, are more associated with Victorian times. And they're considered a dessert or an after, not a side dish. Well, as Georgians slowly made way for Victorians by way of the Regency, the plum pudding also went through some changes. As we've seen, international trade allowed it to become sweeter and richer. But it didn't only change its composition, it also got a different place during the meal. From before or alongside the roast, as a savoury side dish, to a sweet dessert for after the roast. You can still see this in the English vocabulary, especially in posher circles. Here's a little hint. If you ever find yourself in a fancy dinner in England, something like a City of London livery company, an Inn of Court or a posh public school, and you want to give her the impression that you belong and really fit in, don't ask what's for dessert, but ask what's for pudding. It might even be ice cream or cheese. It will still be the pudding. Plum pudding is often seen as a Victorian treat, but as we've seen, plum pudding has been around long before Queen Victoria. But it was under the Victorians that plum pudding became a pudding. Now we know why the plum pudding is as British as clotted cream, the Union flag, and a bulldog drenched in Earl Grey tea. But why is it such a Christmas staple? Well, for that we need to talk a little bit about the history of Christmas in Britain, a country where, at one point, Christmas was banned, and by people who would call themselves very devout Christians. Seems rather odd. It's helpful to know that for a very large part of the history of Christendom, Christmas wasn't the small family circle Hig holiday we know today. It was 12 days of getting smashed after 4 weeks of fasting. As we discussed in our Easter video, periods of fasting were imposed by the church to help ration food. People had to fast, meaning 1 meal a day and no meat, during the Advent or 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, when it wasn't too cold yet. Then, on Christmas, just before winter proper started, they could pig out. In the Middle Ages, this often meant that the pig that was reared throughout the year was slaughtered and turned into, well, puddings, among other things. Later, in the early modern era, especially in the urban areas, this evolved into 12 days of feasting, drinking and dancing. A beautiful example of this is Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which opens on the 12th night of Christmas, with everyone just sitting around drunk or hungover. However, in 1653, after the English Civil War, Cromwell's Puritans banned Christmas, along with music and drinking and pretty much all things fun. No caroling, no drinking and no puddings. Oh. This didn't last though, as soon after Cromwell's death, the Commonwealth was dissolved and Charles II brought back Christmas. The booze was back, and this is still very much a part of the English psyche. It's very common here to go to the pub on Christmas Eve, whereas on the European continent, that's the close family circle evening. So we still have a part of the 12 days of boozing, only it's one evening rather than 12. The shift from big old festival to quiet family holiday is very much a product of the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution. We're not going to go into detail as to why that happened, as that would take us on a tangent about changing values and living patterns, which, to be honest, is more sociology than history. What we are interested in is how the plum pudding now got formally linked with Christmas. We say formally because there were plenty of indicators that some connection was already there. But in 1845, at the height of the Victorian era, Eliza Acton published her book Modern Cookery, which contained the first recipe for a Christmas pudding. Essentially a plum pudding with all the works, formally solidifying the connection between plum pudding and Christmas. But as we said, the connection was already there. A great example was Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which is from 1943, 2 years before the publication of Modern Cookery. So, when did these two get linked? Some people attribute the Christmas pudding to George I. The famous story is that when George I had just been brought over from Hanover and celebrated his first Christmas in England, he was asked, "What does your Majesty want as the final course of the Christmas dinner?" And George I, who didn't speak a word of English, said, "Pudding?" And hence he became known as the Pudding King. This story is a lie. There is very strong consensus among historians that it is completely made up. That didn't stop the Telegraph from publishing it as if it were true though. To be honest, nobody really knows why plum pudding got so intrinsically linked with Christmas. There are some very plausible theories, which are very boring, and some more out there theories. The truth probably being a mixture of all of them. The most prevalent and most boring theory is that plum pudding simply became the standard, well, pudding. On a festive day, and especially a holy day, an Englishman or woman would want roast, and after that roast they would want pudding. Plum pudding. Unlike with, for example, Easter, on Christmas the hearth would already be roaring, making roast beef and its companion plum pudding obvious choices. This is likely true, but there are some theories we like more. Another possible explanation is that plum pudding is the puddingification of plum pottage. Remember how the precursors of pudding were these loose porridges? According to some, for a very long time it was tradition to serve plum pottage for Christmas. The porridge with roughly all the same ingredients as plum pudding and meat, boiled to destruction. But not in a cloth or an intestine, just a loose liquid porridge. This would make plum pudding the puddingified version of the plum pottage. This all sounds very plausible, but our only problem is that the only source saying that plum pottage was eaten for Christmas is a book by Martha Bradley from 1756. In this book she mentions that plum pottage is an old English dish which was cooked for Christmas in the 16th century. So it's a second-degree source, making it a little bit as if people 200 years from now would watch this video to learn about Victorian plum puddings. Not exactly ideal, but still very interesting. Last up is our favorite explanation. Seamen. No. Our sailors are back. Remember the sailor who was the first to mention plum pudding? Well, he did so describing his Christmas meal in 1675. With mince pies and ribs. Then later the Greenwich pensioners who resided at the Royal Hospital in Greenwich would get plum pudding for Christmas, bringing the tradition onto land and very close to London. One pensioner even wrote a little poem. We're lucky this Christmas day, the fish around us all at play, as if they knew our fare abroad, with beef plum pudding to afford. Throughout the Georgian and Victorian era, Britain had a lot of sailors, and if all these people started linking plum pudding with Christmas, well, that's one way to shape a culture. So there you have it, the plum pudding came about because we started boiling porridges in intestines. It's such a British thing, in part because it was so linked with the Empire, and it's a Christmas thing because, among many other things, old sailors really liked it. Now it's time to make our final Christmas pudding, and for this we are going to go very recent. We could of course make Eliza Acton's recipe, but there are already a lot of articles and videos out there doing that. If you want to give it a go, by all means be our guest. But we are going to do something else. Not in the least because we want to keep our powder dry on Eliza Acton. We've got something planned involving her. Make sure you subscribe for that. For our pudding we are going to pay homage to the pudding's nautical heritage by using a recipe from the Nautical Cookery book by C.H. Atkinson, first published in 1930. That's very recent by our standards. Practically yesterday. This recipe for a Christmas pudding was meant to serve an entire cruise, so get ready for an impressive ingredients list. 12 ounces of breadcrumbs, 8 ounces of cake crumbs, 8 ounces of raisins, 1.5 pounds of currants, 1.5 pounds of sultanas, 1 pound of suet, 1 pound of candied peels, 1 pound of apples, 1 pound of sugar, 4 ounces of chopped almonds, 10 whole eggs, remember to crush the shells, 1/4 ounce of nutmeg, 1/4 ounce of salt, 1/8 ounce of mixed spice, and the grated rinds, we call it zest these days, of 2 oranges and 2 lemons. Top all that off with 1 gill of rum. This will give you a pudding of around 5 kilograms, which makes perfect sense if you're feeding an entire crew for Christmas. We are not a crew and we don't like imperial measurements, so we're going to divide everything by 3 and turn it into metric, which gives us 115 grams of breadcrumbs, 75 grams of cake crumbs, 150 grams of raisins, 225 grams of currants, 150 grams of sultanas, 150 grams of suet, 150 grams of candied peel, 150 grams of apples, diced, 150 grams of sugar, 35 grams of chopped almonds, 3 to 4 eggs depending on how big they are, the zest from 1 orange, the zest from 1 lemon, and the spices are just going to be a pinch or to taste. We're filing all of this with 50 milliliters of rum. We'll round it up a little bit at the end. When it comes to making a Christmas pudding, there are a lot of superstitions and symbolisms. If you saw our video on superstitions, you will quickly realize that all of these fall in the odd but harmless category. Firstly, the pudding needs to be made on Stir-Up Sunday. This is the 25th Sunday after the Trinity, which is pretty hard to figure out if you don't go to church every Sunday. Just remember, it's the Sunday before the Advent, which is usually the last Sunday of November, just before you can open that first door. Some say this timing was a medieval edict by the church, but This tradition has no equivalent in other European countries that we know of, and the church had quite a bit of sway there too. We think it simply made sense to take all these yummy things that you did not want to go off and stick them safely into a pudding just before the start of fasting. Then again, another reason why this day is often pointed out as the day to make your plum pudding is concealed within the Book of Common Prayer, a sort of player's handbook for the Church of England. The collect prayer for the 25th day after the Trinity goes, "Stir up, we beseech thee, O Lord, the wills of thy faithful people, that they, plenteously bringing forth the fruit of good works, may of thee be plenteously rewarded. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen." Our little theory is that people went home after hearing this prayer with all the stirring and the fruits and just went, "Feels like a really good day to make a fruit pudding." Inadvertent subliminal marketing. So take all of those ingredients, put them in a bowl and start stirring, clockwise. Why? Lots of stories about it representing the route the three wise men took. Ideally, you get every member of the family in to give it a good stir while recanting the aforementioned prayer. However, if you want to keep it secular, you can go with "Stir up, we beseech thee, the pudding in the pot. Stir up, we beseech thee, and keep it all hot." Another tradition, which does actually have an equivalent on the continent, is to put stuff in the pudding. And by stuff, we do mean stuff. Coins, thimbles, rings, just to name a few. On the European continent, they put a bean in a pie which is eaten on the Epiphany. They used to do the same in England, but then somebody got creative. When you get a coin, it means wealth. A ring means you'll get married. A thimble means you'll stay a spinster, in other words, single. There are a bunch of other things that people stick in puddings with various regional differences, as is normal for folklore. As soon as everything is nicely stirred and blessed, you can put it in a cloth and boil it like we did before, or you can put it in a basin and then put it in a pot of boiling water, steaming the pudding. The latter being the more modern way of doing things. Our recipe seems to allow for both variations. So, since we already boiled one pudding, we're going to steam this one. Tie the pudding cloth over the basin, place it in a pot, and fill it up until just underneath the brim of the basin. Now bring this to a boil, put a lid on it, and then reduce the heat a little bit so it simmers. Let this go for 5 hours. Don't worry if it goes a little bit over, just make sure it doesn't go dry. Keep it topped up. Once steamed, set aside in a larder, not a fridge, it will dry out. And if you want to make it extra festive, pour over a bit of booze every day all the way to Christmas. And then on Christmas Day, steam it for 1 more hour, and then pour over warm brandy or rum and unleash your inner pyromaniac. And that's the history of the Christmas pudding. We hope there was something in there that you didn't know yet. That's really good seamen pudding. Anyway, from all of us here, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, or whatever floats your pudding-fueled boat. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll hopefully see you in the new year.